before you. One by one we will take you.
It's a top 5.
It's a top 5.
Which for us is always a top 10.
It is, because I do top 5 horror movies of a certain year in this case, and you're doing the top sci-fi movies.
I am.
And what is that year? It is 1976. What's your first memory of 1976, David?
Bicentennial. I remember the July 4th celebration was huge that year. And they covered it en masse all over television. You could see like Washington, D.C. and New York and Atlanta and Dallas, I think, was one of them, and somewhere in California, so it was interesting to see the celebration of our country.
The only things I can really remember was Gerald Ford was president, but soon to be Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
Bicentennial quarters were collectible. They're going to be worth a lot of money.
A lot of money. More than a quarter. Yes.
And then I read in doing research that apparently 1976 was the year that both Microsoft and Apple incorporated.
Oh, okay. Well,
So I thought that was interesting
sense.
as well.
Yeah.
But other than that, a bunch of horror and sci-fi movies came out.
Well, I disagree. I think a bunch of horror movies came out, not a bunch of sci-fi. It was I have to say, it was a lean year for science fiction, and it was even leaner year for good science fiction. So
well, and I may be exaggerating a bit. I mean, a bunch of horror movies came out, but not a bunch of good ones. So
yeah, it was very interesting when you look at all the movies released in 76, and there was a lot of action adventure spy. There was a lot of Marathon Man and
All the President's Men.
All the President's Men, all this kind of intrigue, action-y sort of things, which I found was interesting.
Yeah, I didn't look at a top movies of the year outside of our genre. I guess I should have to see what other movies, because I'm not even sure when All the President's Men came out.
Oh, it came out that year.
It did?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. That was a guess. Woo,
man, you did good on that one. I think the preface for both of us, though, to all you guys out there watching and listening, is that I've watched every movie on my list, but some of them not for decades, literally. So I'm going off of a lot of memory, and some of my judgment of it is based on that as well.
We didn't say they were the greatest movies. We just kind of said they're our favorite movies.
Are the top movies of that year in that genre. My number 5 stars a gentleman named Rock Hudson. This was a science fiction called Embryo. It borders more on the sci-fi horror, because it is a lot more, I think, suspenseful than it is actually, but it falls into my category of science fiction because science is integral to the storytelling and the story part of it. Basically dealing with a scientist who develops an advanced embryo breeding program, breeds an entire human, who then turns out to be the villain of the piece. I vaguely remember watching this movie and going, ooh, yeah, it had some okay chills to it, but
Is it cloning?
No, it's not cloning at all. He can take an embryo and with this special, the serum that he, as a Dr. Frankenstein, creates, it's advanced development. So like he takes an embryo of a dog and develops the dog into a full puppy within a few days, and then into an adult by the end of the week. So he does the same thing with a human. The only issue is that she requires more and more of this chemical drug to stay alive kind of thing and not age. And so it ends up being one of those great Twilight Zone-y kind of things at the end where he's chasing her, and as he's chasing her, she's aging. So by the time he finally catches her at the very end of the movie, she's an old lady. And she was, in her 20s when he created her and hatched her, so to speak.
Interesting. I don't think I have ever seen that. I have heard of it.
Yeah.
And from what I remember of Rock Hudson, he had a resurgence in popularity, or respect, I should say, more than popularity, with a movie called Seconds in 1966, which was a science fiction movie directed by John Frankenheimer.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if this 10 years later was his attempt at doing the same because it's sci-fi.
Maybe getting back into it with the you know the significance of sci-fi at the time after 75 and getting ready for Star Wars and all that fun stuff. So yeah, maybe it's not the best movie ever made, no, but it's
memorable.
It's memorable and worth a watch.
Right. Yeah, I think all of mine are worth a watch for sure.
Barbara Carrera is the girl in it that he creates.
Okay.
Yeah.
Don't remember her either.
And Roddy McDowall is in it. One of our,
very cool. Like Roddy.
Yep.
Okay.
He's got it's a cameo, but it's good.
It's your sister, Cheryl!
Well, my number 5, and actually my number 4 too, but my number 5 and 4 fall more into the slasher mystery genre. And my number 5 is a movie called Alice, Sweet Alice.
Ooh, okay.
I watched this movie a dozen times on videotape. I actually owned it. I have not, like you said, seen it in decades. So, my memory may be lapsing a bit on the plot. However, it stars a very young Brooke Shields, 2 years prior to when she made Pretty Baby with Louis Malle.
Okay.
Which is kind of controversial now if you've seen the Brooke Shields biography that's playing on Hulu.
I have. I actually did watch that.
Did you? So did I. That's funny. Well, this was when she didn't do like semi-nude or anything in this movie, but she is murdered in a church and set on fire.
Oh, well, these things happen.
If anyone out there remembers this movie, the main thing they're going to remember is that the killer wears a yellow rain slicker with a hood and a really creepy, almost transparent mask. Very, very reminiscent of Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now, where there's someone running around in a little red hoodie, except this is a little yellow hoodie. Clearly, the director, who really I don't know, and he did not go on to do much, Alfred Sole, was influenced by that film, Don't Look Now. It's just a real seedy movie with slasher shenanigans going on.
Slasher shenanigans, okay.
And it is insinuated that the murderer is I can't remember the character, Brooke Shields' older sister, who is jealous of her confirmation maybe in the church. And then, of course, that could potentially be a red herring. I won't give it away, but we're constantly guessing at who is this masked killer. So Alice, Sweet Alice is my number 5.
Wow, that's a good one. It's interesting because this was a time when, slashers were just about to, come
Explode.
on to the game.
Yeah, I'm not really sure when the first slasher film came out. A lot of people equate it with either Halloween in 78 or Friday the 13th in 1980. And Alice, Sweet Alice would definitely be a slasher movie, I think.
My number 4 is based on a classic and should have been a classic movie, but it's a classic fun watch movie, I guess. It is called The Food of the Gods. It's based on a novel by H.G. Wells, so it comes from good pedigree. However, the movie was done by Samuel Arkoff, if that gives you a hint about it.
I love that movie.
I saw this movie in a drive-in. In
Me too.
76. Yep. And it had some good scares to it. It's a giant creature movie. Basically, to me, it was a great homage back to the 50s, and so, because you had giant rats, you had giant spiders, some classic science fiction. But they kind of turned it, as the 70s were prone to, they turned it into an ecological, disaster, dystopian sort of thing, like Frogs or Prophecy, that kind of feel to it. But it's definitely worth a watch, and especially for 76, I think the effects and everything elevated above like a TV movie kind of feel, and it's a good watch.
I remember liking that movie when it came out and seeing it and being thrilled at seeing giant rats running around. And then I went back and watched that movie like less than a decade ago, and the effects are terrible. But I still love it from a nostalgic point of view, even though it's probably terrible now. Yeah.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her.
The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane.
Wow.
Ironically enough, I picked two movies to begin with, one with Brooke Shields, a child actress, and one with Jodie Foster, a child actress. This one was a little more controversial for Jodie Foster because there is a semi-nude scene in it, but it was played by her older 21-year-old sister. So they got around it that way.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Really? Okay.
This movie is more of a mystery. It's very dark. It's about a little girl that's living by herself. She's kind of sexually harassed by a neighbor played by a young Martin Sheen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you remember that or not. Yeah, and
I
like I said, it's been decades since I've seen this movie. I still like this movie, and this movie gets a lot of respect. It still ranks like a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Didn't Wes direct it?
No. This is a movie directed by somebody I had never heard of. Nicholas Gessner was the director.
Okay.
And when I looked to see what he had also done, I could not find anything. And unlike Alice, Sweet Alice, which was definitely influenced by a Nicholas Roeg film, I don't recall this really being influenced by anything. It was just really creepy how the little girl lived by herself. There were no parents around. Her father was supposedly on a business trip, but there's something in the basement she doesn't want people to find out about. And nosy neighbors, including this one that's kind of harassing her, start snooping a little too close, and events kind of unwind from there. So I don't want to spoil it for anyone out there that wants to see it. I would not rank it highly as a horror movie, though. It is more of a mystery thriller type movie.
And I always equated it, before I'd seen both of them, I always equated it with Last House on the Left, which
makes sense.
Totally dark. And that's why I said Wes, because he did that one.
Right, and they're both very long titles.
My number 3, I am not a fan of this movie, but I think it does work for science fiction in general, science fiction of this era, definitely. And then moving forward to remakes and stuff that have happened since. It's a little film called Future World. It was written by Mayo Simon and George Schneck, directed by Richard Heffron. None of those people you've ever heard of before, or probably ever again. It had, however, a pretty good cast. Yul Brynner returns in it from his Westworld cameo. You also get Peter Fonda, Blythe Danner, who I love Blythe Danner, and I thought she was really underrated. But basically, it's the sequel to Westworld. It's the continuation of it, except now instead of places like Westworld, medieval, and Roman, where you have Spa World. Like, what?
I'll have a massage, please.
Yeah. And Future World. Future World set on a space station orbiting the planet. But basically, the core of it is that the corporation behind Westworld has now reinvented the park, reopened it. It's got these new worlds to it, but their real agenda is cloning major celebrities, cloning major politicians.
For sex.
No, for there is sex. There are sex bots in it, of course.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But which, of course, would come with any AI that we happen to develop when we get to robots.
Yeah, it's right around the corner.
Yep. Probably next month, I think. But no, they're nefariously wanting to take over the world by killing off politicians and putting their robotic clones in place. And it gets really convoluted near the end and turns out to be a chase movie where we're going to try to, expose the evil corporation.
I'm fairly certain I saw that on television as I did Westworld, which is far superior. Yes. I have a question, though, because I don't remember. Are any of the original gang back for this?
The only personnel is Yul Brynner, who comes back as the gunslinger.
Not even Michael Crichton.
No. Well, Michael Crichton, they use him as inspired by, but so just has nothing to do with the writing.
Because he wrote Westworld, they just have to credit him as a writer, and no James Brolin or Richard Benjamin.
Right. Michael Crichton, even Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, which originally owned it, they had nothing to do with this particular production.
Weird. That is so strange.
Yeah, because this is AIP. AIP actually distributed this.
Holy cow. Did you mention Arkoff on another film, or was it this film?
No, Arkoff just two movies ago. He did Food of the Gods. That was Arkoff.
Oh, my God. So you've done 2 AIP movies. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Okay. And I had no idea either one was an AIP movie. Interesting.
Yeah, it was made by AIP which was later bought by Orion and turned into Orion. It has done some things since then. There was a short-lived television series that came from it, and then again, the reboot of Westworld done by Nolan and Joy does borrow some things from this plotting for its second season, which is
only it's far superior.
Yeah. Oh, far superior. Yes, but it's worth a watch.
My number 3 is the one on this list that I actually saw in a theater.
Ooh, okay.
And it was a little thing called Burnt Offerings.
Oh my gosh. Yep.
I went and saw this in April of 1976 on my 11th birthday. And I went with my friend Chris Wilson, and we talked about this movie for months. Love it. Can't say enough good things about it. It will not appease fans of today because it is a slow burn, creepy supernatural horror. There is no blood. But it was Dan Curtis.
The Mike Flanagan of the 60s and 70s, you know.
I don't know that he was that good. But he was definitely a genre representation.
Dominating television horror. He was
sure.
Yeah.
He started with Dark Shadows, as far as I know, in the 60s and 70s, and moved on to classics like the Richard Matheson trilogy of terror. This movie stars Oliver Reed, one of my favorites, Karen Black, Burgess Meredith, Betty Davis. I mean, it's a big cast, and it's based on the novel by Robert Marasco, which I read subsequently. And it's just one of those classic haunted house films with an A-list cast and a very creepy hearse driver that we nicknamed Smiley because he was always smiling. It's one of those, I think it became somewhat of a cliche or maybe a trope in the 70s where houses regenerate themselves. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. I remember seeing the siding, change and the brickwork and everything. I remember
like
that shot.
It looks old and creepy and all of a sudden becomes new again because it's like sucking the life out of the occupants or what have you. The house is an entity. Highly recommend this. It is on our list to cover as far as movies on Johnny Has the Keys, and I look forward to revisiting it.
And they kind of did that with Amityville. It was the same way. They made the house scary. The house was an entity kind of feel to it.
And that was only 3 years later in 1979. So.
Interesting. Yeah, I know how impactful that movie was to you. Burnt Offerings is like your...
I was 11 years old, and that was a killer cool movie.
My number 2, directed by Nicholas Roeg. You probably know what I'm talking about. Called The Man Who Fell to Earth. It's actually British, so it wasn't an American science fiction film, but it was a British science fiction film. Very unique plot, mostly because it's a vehicle for David Bowie. He is great in this movie, but it's got Buck Henry, Candy Clark, Rip Torn, basically a humanoid who travels to Earth from a distant planet, and it's him trying to get used to this world and what it is. And Bowie at that time had such an otherworldly persona.
Always has.
Anyway, that it added so much to the movie, Man Who Fell to Earth.
Why are you torturing me like this?
My number 2 is a little film that we have actually covered on our podcast.
Yes.
Actually, both these, number 2 and number 1, we've covered.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. My number 2 is The Omen. Starring Gregory Peck and Lee Remick. The memories I have of this movie, I did not see it in theaters because it was probably rated R, and maybe Burnt Offerings wasn't.
I saw it at the Princess Theater.
Did you?
I did.
But I heard it was one of those when I was in 6th grade, and I heard everybody talking about it. Oh yeah, there's this priest that gets impaled by a lightning rod, and there's this photographer whose head gets cut off by a sheet of glass. I mean, all you heard was about all these crazy deaths. And if you're a little kid, you want to see it. So of course, I immediately saw it when it was on television, and then eventually, could rent it on videotape. This is a Richard Donner movie. Donner brought us all kinds of stuff like Superman and Lethal Weapon. But this was a horror movie based on revelations from the Bible with the Antichrist being born of an American ambassador in England, I believe.
Yes. Yep.
And he is played by Gregory Peck. It's another one of those movies like Burnt Offerings that has an all-star cast of great actors and probably some of the best movie music of that decade too that I can think of. Right up there with Jaws.
That's what I always remember. Da, da, dun, 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 and all the choral music that was in it. It was so good.
And the scene in the graveyard with the Rottweilers. They dig up the grave. Oh my God.
There's a jackal in the grave. I mean, that was really good. Yeah.
Yeah. So many classic scenes, this movie. Highly, highly recommend this movie if you've not seen it.
I would highly recommend it too. And it has that 70s sort of ending again too, which ends dark. 70s movies either ended with a question mark or ended dark.
Or sad or bad.
Yeah. They didn't. There was no fairy tale ending in the 70s.
Unhappy endings abound for sure.
My number one, I don't think you can do 1976 and say science fiction without this being your number one, which is Logan's Run. Although it is not the greatest science fiction movie ever made, for its time, it was really, really good, impactful, and I think did motivate. If it had not been overshadowed by Star Wars, I think it would have had almost a Blade Runner-y kind of revolution to science fiction filmmaking. It was a very dystopian sort of look, but a happy dystopia. This wasn't a depressing future. This was a beautiful future.
Oh, everything's great. You're just going to die.
Everyone is young, and everyone is having sex, and everyone is wearing, very revealing costumes, and everyone is handsome and nice, and they have a crystal in their hand. And when that crystal turns black, your time's up, bud. You're out.
You're out.
And you voluntarily go and put on your mask and robe and fly around in the air and disintegrate yourself. And that's the look of it. The plot basically is this is 2274, and you are living in a society where everything is beautiful because at a certain time in your life, usually in your early 20s, your life clock runs out and you go and kill yourself. Logan is a sandman who chases those who decide to be runners. Runners are people who don't want to accept their fate and their contribution to society and want to continue to live. How crazy can they be? So he hunts them down and brutally kills them. Suddenly, Logan's clock turns. He has to try to escape and becomes a runner himself, hence that clever title.
And that's Michael York, if you haven't mentioned it yet.
Yes, Michael York plays him, a young Michael York, an extremely attractive Jenny Agutter.
I can think of other things about this movie that make it stand out. One was Farrah Fawcett was extremely popular in 1976, and she's in this movie.
Richard Jordan is Francis, his nemesis.
We need to cover this movie on our podcast because there are so many keys with this movie. I mean, immediately that jumped to mind. Think of things like Soylent Green or Hunger Games. Yeah. I mean, all of those movies were either inspired by or inspired from this movie. And
agreed. I totally agree. And this has a Star Trek, classic Star Trek ending, so to speak, but also that unhappiness of the 70s in that he destroys the computer that is running the city and all of society, leaving everybody to kind of wander out into their ruined world. And now you have to survive, hopefully, maybe.
Well, my number one of 1976 is another movie I did not see in the theater, but that all I heard about in school for years until I could watch it on television is a little movie called Carrie.
A little movie, yeah. That little thing.
1976, Carrie, directed by Brian De Palma, starring yet again another cast that was amazing, even though some of them may have not been as well known at the time. Sissy Spacek, John Travolta, Nancy Allen, Betty Buckley, Piper Laurie. I mean, the list goes on. This was Stephen King's first book and his first movie. This is what put him on the map as far as film.
Okay.
And all I heard about in school was, oh my God, they dump pig blood on her. She goes psycho and starts, killing people.
Yeah.
And it all happens at the prom. you know, we have covered this movie on our podcast. This movie is probably, in my opinion, one of Brian De Palma's best movies, especially his best movie with the split frame technology that he was using at the time, which is a very 70s technique. I talked about on the podcast how the original character in the book is an overweight, unattractive, and I liked how they went with Sissy Spacek, who is not unattractive, but was definitely odd looking, but not overweight, and they could make her look really pretty when she does go to the prom. Nancy Allen is like the biggest bitch as Chris Hardison. I love it when Betty Buckley, the teacher, slaps her across the face. I'm like, that would never happen today, but it is so cool in this movie. And of course, John Travolta is his Vinnie Barbarino self. It's basically, they lifted him from Welcome Back, Kotter and put his character into this movie.
Oh, definitely.
Can't say enough good things about it. I mean, what are your memories? Did you see it in a theater?
Oh, yeah. I remember when we covered it and I watched it again after a few decades, I was amazed at the opening credit sequence and how much nudity was in it and everything else. I was going, really? I did not like the jump scare at the end. I never have liked it, but the performances are great. The photography works. The suspense works. The music. It's a very Bernstein kind of music.
It is very psycho.
Lots of stingers to it and everything else.
But very soft music in the beginning, and that
beautiful
slow-mo
and
scene,
pretty, and and then it goes dun 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 dun, or whatever.
You mentioned not liking the jump scare at the end, but you can't deny the fact that it's iconic because it basically inspired that in movies to come. It's one of the first movies to ever do that. Yes.
Oh, yeah. As a key, it definitely inspired stuff going forward of the
every Friday the 13th.
Every Friday the 13th, I'm going to jump out of the lake and kill you. And I thought Piper Laurie was, she started to me that, and I always associate with Stephen King, but that hysterical zealot kind of character that he tends to put in a lot of his work, saying these are the people you need to be afraid
like
of.
Mrs. Carmody in The Mist. She's just a predecessor of the same character. Yes.
Correct. This zealotous sort of horror that is much more scarier than whatever psychic phenomenon is going on or supernatural sort of thing that's going on. But yeah, I think I don't think you could have gotten away with not saying this was the number one of 76.
And it probably was at the box office as well. I don't know if it outperformed The Omen or not. But, I would say it was very high.
It's better than The Omen, in my opinion. They're both great, but I just think it's a better film than The Omen. Yes, overall. Yeah.
Well, that concludes the top 5. You got any honorable mentions that you?
I have 2 honorable mentions. One is At the Earth's Core. It was not a good movie at all, but it was Edgar Rice Burroughs doing his typical, I'm the hero going to save a princess sort of thing in a prehistoric world. And it had some pretty interesting effects for 76. They didn't do the Harryhausen thing, but they still tried to do a bunch of animation and pterodactyls and all kinds of stuff. I remember that. And then my other one was King Kong. The remake was in 76. And so it was one of my runners up too, but I didn't know, is that really science fiction? Is it really horror? No, not either. It's more of a fantasy.
Yeah. Okay. I don't even know where to begin. First, you mentioned At the Earth's Core. I always confuse that movie with The Land That Time Forgot. And The People That Time Forgot, because they both starred Doug McClure. They all starred Doug McClure.
Yes.
However, the one you're talking about also had Peter Cushing in it, which makes a big difference.
Correct.
So it is probably better than the movies I'm talking about.
It is. Yes. It is better than The Land That Time Forgot. Yes.
Okay. My honorable mentions are one that I have never seen, but I feel like I must mention it because it is very highly rated and it is an esteemed director, and I need to it's on our list. I've just never ever seen the film, so I'm going to mention it, and it is a movie by Roman Polanski called The Tenant.
Oh, okay.
Have
I've never seen it either. I've not.
Okay. Well, it ranks very highly as a horror movie that year. I'm going to mention it just like I said because of the credentials. My second honorable mention is one of yours, and it's the King Kong remake from 1976.
Okay.
I have huge ties to that movie because my mother loved it so much. We went and saw it at a theater like 4 or 5 times.
Okay.
And of course, it is frowned upon now and thought of as probably the worst remake of King Kong. But it had Jeff Bridges, again, star power, Jeff Bridges, Jessica Lange. Nobody knew who she was.
It was her
beautiful.
debut. Yeah.
Oh, she's great in it. Charles Grodin is in it, if I remember right. He's one of the guys that goes to the island to bring him back and promote him. He's the producer or whatever. It was Dino De Laurentiis. I was in the sequel.
You were.
I was an extra in the sequel to this movie, believe it or not. And I don't know. So King Kong, definitely up there in my honorable mentions. And then lastly is a movie I have not seen in ages. Drive-in favorite, The Town That Dreaded Sundown.
Yeah, I was curious you didn't put that on your list.
Yeah, I don't remember a lot. I remember it's a slasher period piece kind of movie because it takes place like in the early 20th century, if I'm not mistaken. It's got a villain with a hood, which predates Jason in Friday the 13th, Part 2. And I just remember my sister being terrified of that movie and a lot of people saying that was a very scary movie from 1976. Did you have any others that you wanted to mention just for continuity's sake?
Not as far as, not from science fiction, but I was curious that you didn't have at least an honorable mention Snuff. That movie came out in 76. And Snuff? I remember that being very influential in my world. That terrified me because at the time I thought they really killed this girl in this movie.
We all thought that.
The plot. But to me, it was, I mean, that's the precursor to Blair Witch and all of these other found footage things. Because
I may have an alternate for that, by the way.
Okay, go ahead.
But Snuff, anything about Snuff that I can remember is that I didn't see it till it was on videotape in the early 80s.
Me too.
And that it was rumored that was a real murder. Of course, it was proven not a real murder later. So it's a very controversial movie, and it is definitely in, I've got it in here for continuity. I didn't have it up there because it's not a good movie at all.
I don't remember the movie being great. I remember like the last 15 minutes being horrific.
Well, that's what it is. It's like a bad movie, and then they tack on a supposed real murder at the end. It's just stupid.
Well, you also didn't do Family Plot, which is the last Alfred Hitchcock. Even though it's not horror, it ended up.
Did that come out in 76?
Yep.
I thought that came out earlier.
Nope. And
that's more of a comedy.
One of your favorite, Karen Black's in it.
Karen Black's in it. Alfred Hitchcock directed it. Bruce Dern's in it. But if I remember right, that's more of a comedy than a horror movie. I've got one that I think may be the first found footage movie, or at least it's right up there with the one that we talk about, Cannibal Holocaust. I can't remember. Cannibal Holocaust came out in 1980. This came out in 1976. It's a movie called Sasquatch, The Legend of Bigfoot.
The Legend of Bigfoot. Yeah,
I went and saw this movie at the Capri Theater in Morristown, Tennessee, and this movie scared the shit out of me because it was real. It was not a movie. It was a documentary, and they were out there in the woods chasing Bigfoot. Mm-hmm. Even though I lived in East Tennessee and it was set probably in the northwestern United States, I was convinced that Bigfoot was coming to my house that night. And I remember them setting up wires, and they had these little monitors where red lights would go off if a Bigfoot was near, and it just scared the crap out of me. I tried to watch this movie about a year or two ago, and it is so awful. I mean, it is so bad that I'm shocked that it had that effect on me as a kid, but it did. I was only 11, so I had to mention that.
The one that got me was The Legend of Boggy Creek. It was that same kind of thing. It was definitely a Sasquatch story, but
was it like
the crap out of me.
Was it presented as a fake documentary?
Yeah.
It was. I thought it was a real story. Okay, I mean like a written story.
Yeah, no, it was presented as this town at night has to close up its doors because you'll hear the Sasquatch, and it'll move around and attack you and stuff.
Well, speaking of creatures, there's a lot of creatures in 1976. We had Eaten Alive, which was a Tobe Hooper film following the Texas Chainsaw Massacre about, I believe, about a giant alligator. Don't remember much about that one, but that one came out in 76. Squirm came out in 76.
Yep.
Another drive-in staple about giant worms. You've already mentioned Food of the Gods, which I had in there. Then there was also sequels. Always sequels coming out. Look What's Happened to Rosemary's Baby. And we had Mako, The Jaws of Death. So people trying to cash in on Jaws. We had Blood-Sucking Freaks, which I remember watching on video, and I thought it was just kind of ho-hum, but I remember it disturbing some of my friends really badly.
Okay.
I don't know why, because it just was probably stupid. And then one I like just for the title alone and the fact that it's a Hammer movie, and that's To the Devil, a Daughter.
Oh, yeah. I remember that title.
Had Nastassja Kinski and Richard Widmark, Christopher Lee, Denholm Elliott, great cast, but I remember nothing about that movie. Do you?
No, but I do remember the title. Yeah.
Okay. But that's what I have to give a little continuity to the year as far as other releases. And some of those, I guess you'd say, were sci-fi as well. Food of the Gods,
right,
for sure.
And there were tons of mainstream releases. Like I said, lots of spy, lots of action. Assault on Precinct 13 was 76, which was, the John Carpenter coming onto the scene. Several big movies came out in 76.
It was our nation's 200th birthday.
That's right. And they celebrated it with horror and science fiction the way they should. Yes.
They did. David, I would like to thank you for joining us. If you like what you see, we've got other shows out there on YouTube, including Coming Attraction Show, Coming to Get You, a Shudder with Tim as far as movies on the Shudder platform, Streaming Horror with me as well, which are basically horror movies on other platforms. And then we have our regular main show, Johnny Has the Keys, where we do an in-depth deep dive. Like we do, you got a taste of it today with these films, but we do one every week. One particular film, and you can catch those on Mondays. And I guess until next time, I'll be seeing you, David.
All right, see you then.
You can't start the car. Johnny has the keys.